Okay, thank you everybody, and thank you to the university for inviting me here. It's been a great experience. I was in Bhopal before this, and I'm just really enjoying myself. But I must apologize, I'm having a wave of jet lag right now, so I'm hoping that I can keep on task and not let my brain kind of fizzle out somewhere in the ether. What I'm going to present to you today has to do with some thinking that I've been doing around the new materialisms in education in particular, and also trying to find a language that works against the instrumentalism that we find so often in education. And so I've been looking at questions around embodiment and particularly questions around sensibility or sensation. And I start off with a quote from the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who writes, "Sensibility is the breakup of every system." It's that, it seems to me, which kind of resists, if you will, the conventional systems and the conventional ways we have of thinking about education. And questions of embodiment, it seems to me, and materiality have recently been the theme of much contemporary discussion in educational practice and research methodology and theorizing in education. This body of literature has largely focused on sort of the materiality of the human body. And bodies are on par with the objects with which they interact. So embodiment and materiality from these theorists' perspectives, which are mostly informed by feminism and the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze, as well as some of the work going on by Jane Bennett, as well as Karen Barad in physics. And embodiment and materiality are not so much woven together in their view as they are mutually constitutive, each change calling forth new possibilities for subjectivity. So there is an emphasis in the literature on activity and movement, and materiality itself being not seen in terms of substance, but as a constellation of processes. So we're no longer talking just about the aspects of the body as being pure materiality, as a hard substance, but in its interaction with an environment, it starts taking on different kinds of shapes and images of itself. But what we find in this literature is that the sensibility of human materiality is often not considered. They talk merely about the materiality of the human body instead. And I'm kind of questioning how sensations, which are bodily sensations after all, that are produced in classrooms, actually matter to the constitution of the body, its surfaces, and its borders. And what does this matter to the ethical aspects of educational relationships? And this is what I'm going to be focusing on today. I'm going to be trying to go through the kind of ethical aspects of what I see to be an important aspect of transformation. So if you want to think of education as a vehicle or as a process of change, whether it's social change or personal transformation, which to me come hand in hand, then I would think that we need to start focusing on how the body actually plays a role in that and stop seeing the mind and body as being kind of divorced from each other. And so to explore these lines of thought, I'm turning to a perhaps unlikely resource in the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, who for some of you is familiar and for others probably not. And given that his work is not generally written about in education in ways that highlight embodiment and materiality, and in fact, he is well known for his attention paid to notions of self and other and how a relationality between self and other actually leads to what he calls an ethical responsibility and an ethical subjectivity. So what I'm going to be doing is actually reading him through the work of Tom Sparrow, who I've mentioned here on a recent work called Levinas Unhinged, as a philosopher of materiality. So I'm reading Levinas's ethics, and what he says about responsibility is actually being sort of resting on and contingent upon his ideas around the body and embodiment. So Tom Sparrow's recent examination of the materialist and metaphysical, as well as the phenomenological aspects of Levinas's ethics, will be my point of departure here. And I propose that Levinas's views of sensibility and embodiment are quintessentially pedagogical aspects of his thought, and I'll go into that a little bit more in detail. That is, they are already rooted in a relational context of change and alteration of the subject, which I'm viewing here as fundamentally pedagogical. And it's a process through which one becomes someone beyond the limits of one's previous incarnation. So, and this is where I'm going to be using the word transcendence. So I'm not using the term transcendence in a religious sense, as it was used this morning, but I am going to be talking about how we transcend our limits through an encounter with the other, and an encounter with the other that is an embodied encounter. So I want to situate the pedagogical question of embodiment first. Elspeth Probyn, in an article discussing the place of affect and bodies in teaching, suggests that the body in particular has been elided, perhaps surprisingly so, within critical and feminist pedagogies. Her claim is largely based on what she sees as an abstraction of the live body. She keeps referring to the live body into complex theory. That is, while there are a plethora of theories about how the body is constituted through power dynamics, normative discourses, and systems of discrimination, little attention is paid to the role played by singular affect and the role the body plays in that. For Probyn, there seems to be a retreat from the experiential body in these pedagogies. Instead, drawing in part, although not exclusively, on the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze, she notes the significance of affect and sensibility in the concrete constitution of the form of materiality known as the human body. And I'm using that precisely convoluted sense to give you a sense of what she's on about here. She sees Deleuze's notion of ethology. He has a notion of ethology that's being described here as particularly inviting. And he writes, as in the quotes here, "A body affects other bodies or is affected by other bodies. It is this capacity for affecting and being affected that also defines a body in its individuality." So bodies are not fixed things. And as Deleuze says, ethology studies the compositions of relations or capacities between different things. And things here also refer to human bodies. As one such relation, a relation that encapsulates the experiential dimensions of the body, Probyn seeks to bring to the attention of her students what she calls the goosebump effect. That moment when a text sets off a frisson of feelings, remembrances, thoughts, and the bodily actions that accompany them. In fact, by inviting students to explore an effective reading that is wild, diffuse, and hard to properly name, she writes, Probyn also invites the body into direct contact with what is going on in classrooms, without, however, suggesting that experiential and sensible aspects of bodies are unrelated to previous circumstances. So it's not the body is like constantly made anew each time it comes into contact with something. Our bodies also inhabit and also contain within it a history. And she writes, what constitutes an affective response is hugely complex and is in part the result of an embodied history to which and with which the body reacts, including how the classroom is conceived and practiced. So what you're getting here is an understanding that if you're looking at various ways in which we often approach education in terms of teaching moral virtues and the like, what her work is suggesting here is that we can't be so naive. I mean, that in some ways, how a body responds and how its affective sensibilities are mobilized in a classroom are actually quite unpredictable and complex elements. And so she writes, how better to explain that always quirky, always unknowable combination that is the classroom? Why is it, we ask either in elation or depression, that the same material will work so differently in different situations? The magic or chemistry that seems so elusive to any systematization may well be the necessary result of the moving arrangement of particles, histories, and affects that are the bodies of teaching and learning. So she's really trying to focus on the notion that the very idea of teaching and learning, the very idea of education is an embodied one. We cannot talk about ideas separate from the actual lived realities and lived contexts in which they take place. So if changes in bodies are occasioned by these unpredictable and unknowable relations between things, then the transformative potential of feminist or critical pedagogies is equally uncertain and no longer tied to the effects of a particular discourse, theory, or practice. Rather, the pedagogical transformation of the subject is more in line with what Lucy Irigaray, another French philosopher, would call the alchemy of subjectivity. It's like these magical things kind of come together to produce the subject, and less dependent upon what critical and feminist pedagogies would call consciousness raising. And introducing this unpredictability, however, into our educational discussions should not be seen as some nihilistic defeat of pedagogical purpose, but instead as the generative potential for moving beyond the systematization and organization of teaching and learning into discrete elements. And I think it's this anarchic sensibility that challenges assumptions that the right kind of teaching will produce the right kind of learning outcomes, which is what we're all, I think, it's inundated with in this global educational reform movement. And so as such, it offers, I think, a powerful critique against the types of managerialism and performativity-based frameworks for systematizing teaching and learning, and that we're finding on a global scale. As Levinas himself acknowledges in the epigraph to this paper that I started with, sensibility is the breakup of every system. Sensibility is precisely that which cannot be contained, directed, or enforced by tightly defined procedures and institutional arrangements. In other words, we can't control it. Probin's call for exposing the centrality of the live subject for classroom contexts thereby opens up a way of thinking pedagogical transformation that necessarily takes into account the way bodies also transcend and are not merely products of structure and system. So it's also getting away from a kind of a Bourdieuian sense of a reproductive theory of education. Moreover, paying serious attention to the live subject means acknowledging the sensible body, without which words such as encounter, teaching, and learning make little sense. What Probin in effect exposes, although this is not her primary goal, is that you cannot have an educational practice, or any practice for that matter, without live subjects in the first place. It just doesn't make sense. These are not disembodied ways of being. Practices are themselves embodied. And so I'm going to turn at this point in the paper to a reading of Levinas. How much time do I have, Randy?
Well, you can take 13 minutes.
Perfect. That would be great. This part of the paper gets a little bit into notions of transcendence and stuff, so I'm going to skip some of it, but I'll keep to the slides here. In Levinas's work, there are tremendous images. So you get a sense when reading Levinas's depiction of subjectivity, of a subject who's cast into a winter desert, cold and unprotected from the winds. He uses this very poetic language. The subject is vulnerable and sacrificial, wounded and bound, defenseless and subordinate. And out of all of this rises a subject that is responsible for the other. And these images of the subject that he writes about I think are striking because they call forth a radical sense of embodiment. He's very attuned to describing the subject in very physical terms. Images are not merely metaphors for a subject whose naked skin is vulnerable to the elements in the passing of human time. Rather, such images of embodiment call forth a reality, insofar as they seek to approach through language the pulsing sensibilities that arise in experiencing the vicissitudes of life. So images here also call forth a transcendence, insofar as it is through their inarticulable embodied relation to the other that one's ego surpasses its own limitations. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And on the surface of things, this way of casting embodiment in terms of both sensibility and transcendence would seem to be contradictory and perhaps somewhat removed from the notion of the body I discussed above in relation to education. However, as Tom Sparrow points out, it is at the intersection of embodiment, materiality, and metaphysics that Levinas's work gets pretty interesting. So Sparrow writes, I think that, when Sparrow writes that Levinas is somebody who's specifically engaged with the material nature of ethics. And he's thinking about the insubstantiability in some ways of thought at the same time. So Levinas's work is always playing between this sense of a rooted figure, this embodied figure, and the fact that when that self meets another, that self actually goes beyond itself. It actually transforms itself. So it's that Sparrow is actually very engaged with explaining. And when Levinas discusses the encounter with the other, so when I meet the other, he does not suggest that the other just appears to me. So he's not just taking a phenomenological view that can then be read and understood through my sensations and perceptions. It's quite the opposite. It's the mystery and unknowability of her invisibility of the other that reveals themselves. This invisibility is precisely what is suggested when Levinas claims that when we truly face the other, we do not even notice the color of her eyes. That is, it's a gestalt. The embodied other remains independent of the intentionality of the self or the grasping of the self, as the one who seeks to know the other through concepts, categories, and distinctions. So for Levinas, I think what's really important to sort of underline here is that the other, it's the mystery of the other that we come into contact with. And that's where our curiosity arises. It's where our responsibility to know and learn from the other arises. So Sparrow writes, sensation does not need to be communicated through a sign, symbol, or concept. It is the body that comprehends, or rather accommodates, the power of sensation. And this kind of attitude toward that sensation somehow isn't to be just theorized away or can be easily known even within ourselves, but it's fundamentally, first and foremost, an experience. And how do you think about experience in that very raw sense in terms of having any kind of educational meaning? But the question arises, of course, are not sensations already culturally and socially coded? And Sarah Ahmed's work on affect theory has done a lot to think about the codification of affect. And so the response that I want to offer here is, while I take on board precisely the kinds of affects that she's talking about, I think that following Levinas here and his move to the capacity of the subject for transcendence, the kind of sensation one's experiences may indeed be, named and analyzed, but the experience of the sensation itself lies in a state prior to language. And that's what I'm going to be asking, that we kind of try to think about those kinds of experiences as happening in classrooms and what it is that's pedagogical about them and what it is that we do about them. And so the other here is always more than an appearance, to reiterate. She is more than what I can experience of her. And so the other's existence always exceeds my perception. So when we're talking about issues around dialogue, for instance, as we did this morning, or when we're actually talking about physical encounters between students and teachers or amongst students themselves, the other can never fully be known, nor should that be our goal, to know the other. The goal is to actually understand that the other is somebody other than I can ever know. And from that position, then I'm opened up to questions around what kinds of conversations and what kinds of responsibilities and what kinds of response I can have to you based on that unknowability. Now, I go into a fairly long, detailed argument in the paper about how the body is both transcendent and concrete in two senses. And so I just want to talk about, just mention them very briefly here, that the concrete nature of experience obviously lies in the sensate body and the whole sensibility. But the transcendent nature is here in terms of also it creates the transcendental conditions of practical life, so that we can have these kinds of experiences, and that we do have these kinds of experiences are the condition for living our lives in practice. And that sensation actually enables us to move beyond our own sort of fixed identities. So reading Levinas's work in terms of materiality, I think, allows us to posit the centrality of sensibility in sort of moving toward the other as an act of transformation and to become a responsible subject. It gives weight to the importance of unnamed or unnameable experience as a condition for that movement to take place. And it conceives of subjectivity in terms of its pliability and plasticity as it comes into contact with its environment. So the body is not something that's ever fixed. Bodies, as we know from critical race theory, are racialized, and those racializations shift according to different contexts. Bodies are not something that ever stay the same. Even biologically, you know, how our cells are transforming so that we're actually a whole living new entity after at least, I think, 7 years or something. So ethics and embodiment in education, and just some concluding remarks here. So what I want to suggest here is this focus on materiality that is an important focus in terms of thinking about the physicality of classrooms and the vulnerability of the other in those classrooms. In my talk in Bhopal, we actually talked quite a bit about the vulnerability of teachers actually in classrooms, and how I think a material focus on this might actually put bodies and practices back in their rightful place in educational discourse. And following Levinas, this sensibility is a condition for ethical responsibility. So having that, the susceptibility or capacity for being open to the other, being affected by the other and affecting the other, this is where Levinas locates kind of the ethical demand. And what I'm suggesting in my reading of Levinas, which is much more detailed than I was able to give you here, is that the plasticity of the subject is the very nature of the Levinasian ethical subject. And so what I'm trying to think about here is how such a view of this plasticity, because we're looking at a body in constant change, and sensations of bodily experiences, these are eminently, I think, pedagogical experiences. So it's not just that the subject is transformed through some kind of intellect, but it's also transformed through the bodily experiences it has and is confronted with, basically. And so how do we allow the sensate body to exist in education and see that existence is valuable in its own right, without overly theorizing the body, without having a concept of the body that isn't actually paying attention to how bodies actually interact in their classroom environments? And practices of attunement perhaps can be sort of thought about in relationship to the unpredictable qualities of bodily responses, so that teachers and students perhaps become a little bit more attuned to the ways in which bodies are involved in knowledge construction, in knowledge production, and in other kind of almost ineffable qualities of classroom relations. And my question, I guess, that I'm leaving with you is that could this not engender a more expansive ethics of teaching? One that's not just talking about some kind of self-consciousness or consciousness or awareness about the purposes of having a more refined ethical approach to teaching, but actually treating ethics as a living, embodied practice, that my attention and my treatment of you actually is very much rooted in bodily responses together. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sharon. We've got plenty of time for questions. Okay, up here.
Thank you. I'm having a little trouble grasping your presentation, very interesting and complex. If one had to reduce it to a sentence or two, would it be something like the following? In any teaching-learning relationship, the ontologic should be key and, in a way, dominant, although the epistemic and the political should also be clear and balanced?
I'm not sure that I would have said that, but no, I think in a sentence or two what I'm trying to get at is how do we actually start appreciating the sensible elements of our teaching and learning situations, and doing that through an understanding of the materiality of the body as being central for how we actually perform ethics. So that the body is not incidental to ethics. Ethics is not something that's going on in my mind without any kind of relationship to actually other embodied subjects. So I'm really trying to inject educational discourse with live human beings again. I come from a context in Europe where, every kind of curriculum reform that's been put on the table largely has been around knowledge that is totally separate from the lives of youth. It's focused on skills that are not immediately meaningful, going back to Catherine's presentation. And it's not that we don't have good reasons for those, or why they might be the case or why they might not be the case, but somehow we've lost the ability to talk about education on other terms. And we've lost the ability to talk about the importance of ethics in terms of living subjects. And that, to me, seems to be, there seems to be something terribly wrong with that. How can we have an education without paying attention to embodied beings? I don't know. You're chairing.
Thank you very much. I have, I think, 3 points of disagreement, and I'll try to articulate them very, very shortly. The first point, if you look at, not at Levinas, but at Husserl, at the original account of intersubjectivity, body-mediated intersubjectivity, and if you look at Hegel, so there is from the very beginning an interconnection between the self and the other, between the ego and alter ego. So, and then, if that is the case, then the very talk of mystery, of self-transcendence is pointless, because the other is already there from the very beginning of the human life. So there's nothing about transcendence here. This is the first point. The second point is, very briefly again, when I claiming that there's a kind of sensation prior to the language, so it seems to be another kind of dualism between sensual data and concepts. So it could be a kind of a new version of the myth of the given, actually. If you want to put it in a provocative way, a new kind of positivism there. And the third objection is actually that I'm just wondering how you can try to develop a kind of educational ethics and at the same time to avoid formulation of norms or of rules. Because what I'm seeing at your talk is appeal for openness, for plasticity, but there's not any kind of norms or notions of norms about ethical action or ethically founded action in the educational realm. Thank you.
Thank you, Casimir, for that. First of all, Hegel and Levinas are not talking about the same self and the same other. So he's not coming from that tradition. So for him, an other is simply another existence. So he comes at it much more from an existential position, if you will. So that he has in one part, we can share together, we share a life together, we share goals together, we share a language together, but we are not the same. We do not share an existence. So, and he goes into a lot about solitude and all of this kind of stuff. So whenever you meet somebody, I'm going to be reducing what he's saying into a more practical context, which is not what he has written about. But when you meet somebody, it means that you can share something with that person, but you cannot know about their existence. And I think that there's got to be a bit of I think that's where respect comes from, actually, is not assuming to know. And rather it leaves you open for asking a question and being curious about that person. And so I think that that's, for me, the difference. So it's not a Hegelian intersubjectivity. In fact, intersubjectivity is not what Levinas is concerned with. But the second part, the sensation and you know, this prior to language, I mean, I am really grappling with this because, I come from discourse theory, I come from a background, but at some point I reached the limits of that. And I would like to, now it's not that I'm not trying to approximate what I'm trying to say to you today with language, outside of language, of course, but I think there are impacts of aesthetic experiences, for instance, that even though we can talk about them, language only approximates the experience. And I really would like us to come back to having some kind of understanding of what an experience actually, that they exist in the classroom, even though we can't theorize them necessarily. So that unnameable quality, I think, actually does have a profound effect, at least it has in my own life, about the changes in direction of my thinking and everything else. But that raw experience that I have, that push in the gut, the heart pounding, the sweat popping off, those kinds of experiences cannot just be talked away. I think that's what I'm trying to say. And I certainly don't want to go to a positivistic dualism, so I'm trying to work some of this out. And then the other one about educational ethics. I'm wanting to reserve the term ethics precisely not to talk about norms and values and morals. If you want to talk about norms, values, and morals, then I'll use that language. But when I'm talking about ethics, I'm really wanting to talk about a relationship. And so it's not to say that morals and values and norms are not important in education, but I think I don't want to reduce ethics to those kinds of issues and those kinds of problematics. So I think ethics for me is actually much more of a practice than it is sort of just a branch of philosophy that includes, all of these things. So I'm trying to actually think through the practice of it.
I'll just intervene here. So why couldn't someone coming from virtue studies respond to what you just said by saying, look, we've had a branch of ethics which has been going for at least 3 decades now, which is about resituating our ethical life in the fact of our being embodied creatures who are full of dispositions, and look at a typical way of defining what a virtue is, and it would refer to manifesting emotion, manifesting what you do with a certain manner, certain gesture, all the things that that you could presumably be referring to using the word materiality. So that's been there. I mean, that's been there for several decades. So, and of course, people who do that are trying to talk about that in connection with norms and so on.
But I still want to reserve some language for not talking about it the way virtue and character education, for instance, talks about it. I think that when you say defining a virtue, that's exactly the kind of language that I'm trying not to fall into. So the question for me is, if we take one step back from that, how do we talk about what it is that we value together or not together in ways that leave open virtues, or the definition of virtues, leave them open, so that they're not signified already, but they're actually become signified through the encounter with each other. And I think that's a different kind of thing. So it's not to say that I don't value certain things in my own life, so I'm not saying that. But what respect means for me, and what respect means for one of my students, is often quite different too. Those things are inflected by a whole bunch of other kinds of considerations, cultural, linguistic, that kind of thing. But the question is, for me, how do I approach that situation? And that, for me, is the ethical relationship, not what it is we come to an agreement about or not. I don't know if that made sense. But.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask a question. On the one hand, the ethical life in Levinas's terms, is resisting systematization of things. And then towards the end of your talk, you talked about practices of attunement. And I suppose there's a slight worry that in the context particularly of educational curricula and programs, where students are, where we are encouraging ourselves and each other to form structured practices of attunement for the purpose of, I don't know, some kind of embodied being, which is perhaps very profound, but as after a sort of few years on the curriculum becomes actually quite, tedious. And so, I'm just wondering, it seems to be pulling in two different directions, systematization and the attention, perhaps, of physicality and embodiment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because that's not my intention. I'm going to have to think about that then, because there is a way in which I want to talk about more the dispositional sort of aspects that come into when you're thinking about teaching and ethical relationality. What kinds of dispositions arise? And I don't want to fix those, because I think in different contexts, as Probin is talking about, in different contexts, different dispositions arise because the context is different. So it's not like I show the same kinds of qualities to all of my students in the same way, because different students and I have different relationships. So I totally understand what you're saying. I mean, as soon as you start concretizing, and particularly in a school curriculum, it just becomes also one more thing that the teachers have to do, and I'm very aware of that, and I certainly don't want to go down that path. But there's a kind of a logical problem, if you will, about how do we think about the radicality of relationships in the classroom without wanting to give a laundry list of what kinds of things we have to do to promote those kinds of relationships in the classroom. So I appreciate that question. Thank you.
Time for one or two.
I'm just trying to understand the concept of sensibility that you tried to sketch today, because to me it appeared that sensibility is not just the bundle of sensations. Mm-hmm. Seems that it is something more, and I'm grappling with that. What and at the same time sensibility seems to be embodied, but it is not bodily alone. Something. So I'm just trying to grapple with.
Yeah, well, because there's two general meanings that we mean by sensibility, right? I mean, there is the sort of a sensibility as a kind of an attitude or approach or an orientation. And then sensibility also means this kind of, this bundle of sensations, as if you call it. But I think what Levinas is talking about, and that's the language that I'm borrowing from here, is that it's both and, if you understand what I mean. When he refers to a sensibility, he's actually referring to the subject that experiences sensations, but it's a subject who is necessarily open to those sensations. And as subjects, as embodied subjects, we are open to sensations. We cannot help it. Even when we don't want to be, we are. We're affected. We're affected by the world. So he links sensibility in that sense to being susceptible to people and things in our environment, so that otherwise we wouldn't change. We wouldn't be able to grow. We wouldn't be able to flourish. To use other kinds of languages here. So we wouldn't be able to make those kinds of transformations if we weren't already susceptible to being affected by our environment. And that's what he refers to as sensibility. So it's a very embodied sort of condition of a relationship to the world. That's what he's talking about. I don't know if that helps, but... Mm-hmm.
Time for one. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sharon, for your presentation. It was interesting to see how you got Levinas into the whole embodiment and affectivity. My problem with generally Levinas as a whole is about the kind of weight of the responsibility that he's giving to the self. And So I want to talk about not the vulnerability of the other, but vulnerability of the self in a democratic society which has isolated individual to an extent that their only connection is through identity politics. And then when they come in face to face with the otherness of the other, instead of being mystified or being curious about it, they are insecure and they want to use some kind of prejudiced views to constantly judge that. And that there is so much of that vulnerability, and we can see all around. So is the self ready to take that responsibility which Levinas wants to give to him in terms of being open to the otherness of the other, which can't be even articulated? So that kind of...
Thank you for that. I mean, one of the things is that Levinas is not talking about individuals. So he's not talking about it on that level of identity politics, and he's not talking about the, in an ironic way, the empirical subjects, if you will. So, but what he is talking about is how we bear, how do we come to responsibility? And his way of explaining it is through this kind of singular existence. So he's looking at singularity as the sort of the starting point, and what he calls a diachronous relationship to the other, so that you and I might be occupying the same room, but your existence is not my existence, and my existence isn't your existence. And from that position, then he goes on to thinking about, I can never demand from you that you take responsibility for me. I can only ask that of myself. And so it's a radical kind of move, and a lot of his work has been compared to Buddhism, for instance, in that kind of radicality of a non-self. So he's not talking about self in the traditional Western terminology, I don't think, and certainly not about individualism. Now, how can you use his work for actually thinking about practical things like I'm trying to do around educational practice? And that's it's tricky. I find it very tricky to do. I've always found it tricky to do, but there's something in it that intrigues me about doing it. And I keep being drawn to it for some reason, because I think it gets around some of those discourses precisely around identity politics that fixate on individuals and others as coming from very, kind of fixed communities and become representatives of those communities. So it's helped me to think about kind of questions around cultural differences and social justice across differences from another kind of lens.